I'm Ruth Ann Dobek, the Executive Director of the Brookline Senior Center and Council on Aging, and I just want to warmly welcome all of you for a day that we think is going to be inspiring and interesting and exciting. So thank you all for coming out this morning. It's a jam-packed day, so I'm not going to take a lot of time on my introductory remarks, except to say that we are very proud to bring this event and all types of events to keep your brains healthy, your minds, bodies, and spirits. That is the mission of the Senior Center and all of our community partners. So again, thank you. I would now like to introduce our friend, neighbor, and community partner, the Executive Director of Center Communities, Rhonda Gleiman. Please welcome Rhonda.
Good morning and welcome to our Senior Expo. On behalf of Center Communities and also our parent organization, Hebrew Senior Life, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you here today. Today promises to be an engaging day of education, hands-on workshops, and conversations around ways to live a healthy and a happy life. Hebrew Senior Life exists to transform what it means to age in America and to promote the independence and well-being of all seniors today and for generations to come. Founded in 1903, today, we are New England's largest nonprofit provider of senior living, healthcare, research, and teaching, and are the only senior care organization in the country affiliated with Harvard Medical School. At Center Communities, we are dedicated to enhancing the quality of life for seniors, their families, and the Brookline community. I feel very fortunate to work here in Brookline, not only because of the warm sense of community and the fact that Brookline is nationally and internationally recognized as an age-friendly town, but also because the spirit of collaboration, respect, and excellence is truly extraordinary. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Senior Expo Planning Committee, including Chairperson Laura Baber, town leaders Nancy Daly, Ruth Ann Dobek, and Lynn Karsten, and committee members Elaine Abrams, Jane Baker, William Burgee, Jennifer Davis, Laura Grzybowski, Laura Katz-Lekew, Jill McDonald, Ginny Major, Tammy Sadok, and Julie Washburn, who have worked tirelessly to make this Senior Expo possible. Also, a special thank you to Ryan Construction for generously sponsoring the event, to the Brookline Council on Aging, Health Department, and Goddard House for enthusiastically partnering on this, to Josh Botsford, Caitlin Bourgeois, and Morrison Food Services for contributing and preparing the delicious food today, and also to Whole Foods for their donation of food, and to the Brookline Senior Center for graciously hosting us. Thank you to all. And it wouldn't be complete with also thanking the many organizations that are here and participating today, including the Brookline Police Department, Department of Public Health, Massachusetts Alzheimer's Association, Brookline Mental Health Center, Brookline CAN, Brookline Recreation Department, Brookline Public Library, the Medical Reserve Corps, and AARP. And finally, thank you to all of our fabulous speakers and presenters, including Dr. Dennis Salko and Regina Dane, Ellie Horowitz, Cynthia Rosenberg, Charles Styron, Nancy Emerson Lombardo, CCB's very own fitness specialists, Caitlin Tesser and Chris Young, and also to Dr. Jennifer Rhodes Croft, who you'll hear from later this afternoon. She is the director of the CCB Medical Practice. All of us share a commitment to your health and well-being, and all of us share a commitment to you. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the day. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Board of Selectwoman Nancy Daly.
Thank you. Well, I'm so delighted to see the room full today because we have a very interesting program. And I want to say I'm Nancy Daly. I'm a member of the Board of Selectmen here in town, but I am also co-chair of Brookline as an age-friendly community, which is a designation we got from the United Nations World Health Organization after applying and telling them of all the things we have for seniors and other plans we had to enhance our opportunities for seniors in Brookline. And it was a few years ago as we were working on that we were thinking, you know, we have a lot of stuff, but we need to find a better way to get the information out to seniors about all that's available in town. And that's when the Center of Communities came to us and said, we'd like to do a senior health fair. And I said, wow, that's funny, because that's just what we were thinking we needed to do. So it worked out well, and we had our first one 2 years ago. And I'm delighted we're doing it again, and I hope we make it a regular event. So there's a number of great things going on today, and you will hear more about them later, but the first one, I am very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Dennis Selkoe. His topic of his talk is Use It or Lose It, Keeping Our Brains Healthy as We Age. Dennis is the Vincent and Stella Coates Professor of Neurologic Diseases at Harvard Medical School. He's co-director of the Ann Romney Center for Neurologic Diseases at the Brigham. And most importantly, from our point of view, he is the husband of our own Polly Selkoe, who's the assistant director for regulatory planning in our planning department. So if you've ever renovated your house or been involved in any kind of building project, or the senior center, in fact, Polly was very involved in getting that built. So. Now, some of Dennis's work over the past 35 years has been groundbreaking, and it has formed the basis for a number of trials that are going on now that drug companies are doing to try to find some drugs that will be effective to alleviate the Alzheimer's symptoms. So let's all welcome Dennis.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How's everyone doing? You all look bright-eyed and ready to learn a lot about how to keep your mind alive and well. Some folks may be coming in, and you might want to just come right in and have a seat. There are other seats here. But first of all, can you hear me at all? Even louder. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to yell. I want to thank Nancy for that nice introduction. Now you can hear me. And Nancy said something very important. She said, I think, first and foremost, we want to thank Polly Selkoe for having Dr. Selkoe here. And I want to also. I'm very happy that Polly invited me. And we're a husband-wife team in a way. So she's sort of my agent when I go on the road to talk. I'm not going to embarrass her anymore. So can you hear me now? Pretty good? Okay, great. So today we're going to spend a little while together talking about the aging brain and how to keep it healthy. And the title of my talk, Use It or Lose It, is emblematic of what you are doing here at the Brookline Senior Center. So in a word, what you've created here and what you are using here is what I want my patients to do, what I want folks to do generally, to stay engaged, socially active, physically active. I saw the exercise room. I got a great tour of the place. And you have to use this place every day in order to avoid the kinds of problems that I work on in my research laboratory, things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. The main message I have for you is that there are two kinds of activities that can keep your mind fresh and young. Physical activity, and we know that, and there isn't a doctor in the world, Dr. Balsam, my colleague and friend here, will tell you the same thing. If you don't stay physically active, things deteriorate. So you should walk over here if you can, or bicycle over here if you feel comfortable with that, or use your skateboard, or a little boat with a sail on it that you can sail right along Harvard Street. The more you do physically, the more likely it is that your nerve cells will stay intact and healthy. And the second kind of activity is what I hope you're going to be doing right now, which is thinking. That is, if you engage in topics that you don't know that much about, and you hear some unusual words or jargon, and you have to puzzle out what someone is saying, even if they're a professor at Harvard Medical School, you've got to figure out what it's all about. That's very good. It's very important for you to stretch your minds and to think of new things. And some people do that by doing words with friends. Some people I know, early in the morning. And other people do it by doing the crossword puzzle or doing Sudoku or whatever it might be, solving the Rubik's Cube, which no one can do. Those are good things to do, but it's also important to keep your mind active by reading, by watching television. Some dose of television can be good, and by engaging with your friends. So coming here and playing bridge or canasta or mahjong or whatever you can play, I can't play any of those games, that's very good for your mind. The more you do that, the better. Now, the other thing that you should know about is that you need to choose your parents very carefully. And I assume you've all done that because you look happy and healthy. Some of you are approaching my own age and getting along in years. And the reality is that if you didn't get around to choosing your parents carefully, you have to deal with the genes that you were given. And that's what I do in my profession. We do a lot of work on genetics that can lead people to have not very healthy aging. As they get older, they lose memory, they decline. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I decided not to show slides because they're often sort of scientific gobbledygook and it's hard to understand the slides, and I'm just going to tell you in words and use one prop that I brought with me how we have figured out what Alzheimer's disease is all about and how it relates to the normal brain aging process, and maybe how we can treat Alzheimer's, which has been much in the news recently. And then, most importantly, I'm going to only speak for another maybe 5 or 7 minutes and then hope to take your questions. So part of this mental exercise is for you to get ready to disagree with some of the things I'm saying, or ask questions that stretch my mind a little bit. Or if I can't figure out what the answer is, Alan Balsam will answer for me, because he knows everything. He's a public health expert. So I want you to start thinking about what questions you have about any aspect of how to keep your brain happy and healthy and aging. I'm going to ask you a question. Do you know how many brain cells or nerve cells there are in your brain? So what could the number be? I'll give you a choice. So, what's that? Million. Okay, so I'm going to use that as the first choice. So there are 3 choices here. This is a multiple choice test. And in my brain and in your brain, it's all about the same, all the brains. There could be 1 million cells. That would be choice 1. And then there could be, let's say, 50 million cells. That would be choice 2. And the third choice will be 500 billion cells. That's choice 3. So who votes for choice 1, 1 million cells? I think you better vote for it. Okay, and who votes for choice number 2, which is 50 million cells? And who votes for choice number 3, which is 50 billion cells? So,
50 billion plus 1.
Less 1, exactly. So 50 billion cells, and it might actually be 100 billion cells, are the number of neurons or nerve cells in your brain, which is astounding. And every one of those cells, every one of the 50 billion, has about 3 billion little bits of DNA in a big molecule. So it's unbelievable how complicated the brain is. And what scientists have done in the last 50 to 100 years is figure out some of the rules about how we think. And when we think, when you listen to me and you try to make sense of what I'm saying, there's a series of electrical messages that go through the brain. They use something called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are message molecules that let you go send information from one cell to the next. One of the famous message molecules is called adrenaline. So adrenaline is a word you've heard. We think of it more as something that pumps up your muscles and gets your heart going and makes you run out fast. But adrenaline, or noradrenaline, is also a neurotransmitter. And there are other neurotransmitters. There's one called acetylcholine. And if you have mild Alzheimer's disease and you come to a doctor like myself, we will prescribe a medicine that will boost your acetylcholine in your brain. These medicines have names like donepezil, or the brand name is called Aricept. Many people have heard of Aricept. The drug companies are very good at spending a lot of money figuring out fancy names. Another drug is called Exelon. I wish it were as excellent as its name, but it helps a little bit. And so when we see someone who has something beyond the normal mild memory difficulty that all of us get as we get older, just beyond forgetting a certain name of someone that you see from time to time. You can't remember the name, but then 5 minutes later you remember her name. Or you can't get the word out you want to say, but then 2 minutes later the word comes right out, or maybe 2 hours later. That's okay. We all do that. I've told my wife, Polly, that if I do that, it must be normal. Because what I do is defined as normal. That's how I think of it as a scientist. And so it is normal to not remember a name for a moment or a long moment, to not get a word out that you want to say, and to be slightly disoriented or slightly confused for a moment. But when that kind of problem happens many times during the day, when time and again you can't figure out who someone is or what they just said to you, or you repeat yourself, or you forget something that someone said to you 5 minutes earlier. And if that happens regularly, not just once or twice or even 10 times, but it happens every day or every other day, and you notice it, or perhaps you don't. Perhaps your daughter notices it, or your son notices it, or your spouse. Then you would come to a doctor like myself and be evaluated for a possible memory disorder, a memory impairment. Now, memory impairment can be diagnosed very specifically by doctors nowadays. We can do special tests. We can even image the brain. And we can even do an analysis of the spinal fluid, which sounds scary, but it isn't, but it's done right. And you can use these tests to find out, do you just have a normal memory problem that all of us get when we get to be 65, 75, 80? Or do you have, God forbid, Alzheimer's disease or another one of the dementias? Now, if we decide that you might have early Alzheimer's disease, we've now figured out what goes wrong. And I'm going to bring out my one prop, which is a Bic pen. So if you ever have a Bic pen on you, and I encourage you to carry it with you all times, you have a 2-scale model of the bad guy in Alzheimer's disease. So this pen is a model for me and a symbol of a protein that's in my brain and in your brain. And it's called the amyloid parent protein, or APP. So how many here have heard of the idea of amyloid plaques in Alzheimer's? Quite a lot. Polly? Okay.
At dinner.
How could Polly not have raised her hand? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So, in fact, Polly could give this lecture. So the amyloid plaques are one of the 2 abnormalities that Alzheimer described. He was a psychiatrist he worked mostly in Munich at the time, Alois Alzheimer, and he described the first woman that had the disease that eventually bore his name. And the other abnormality in the brain, some of you may have heard, are called tangles. Have any of you heard of tangles? Okay, so you've heard of amyloid plaques, and these are called neurofibrillary tangles. Now, the way these build up in your brain and mine, if we get Alzheimer's, is that the amyloid protein, which we call the amyloid parent protein, or APP, gets cut. So it sits in a nerve cell like this. Again, the Bic pen is a model of a protein that's in your brain and mine. And the first cut comes here, and Bic made his pen right, and this comes apart. This part does good things in the brain. And then this part is left, and it sits in the wall of a cell. And then a second cut occurs. And we actually figured this all out at the Brigham Women's Hospital over the last few years. And their second cut is here. And if Bic made his pen right, the clasp of the pen would come off. And this little piece is called amyloid beta. And it makes up the millions and millions of plaques that Alzheimer's sufferers develop. So in summary, the Bic pen is a model of a protein you and I have throughout life. Everybody has it. It's all normal. And the cutting process is normal also. And if you cut twice, you release the clasp of the pen. That's the little piece that makes up the millions of amyloid plaques in the brain. Now, that's the biology, enough science. What are we going to do about it? If I develop a little bit too much cutting, which is what can happen to people, and I build too much of the clasp of the pen, too much amyloid beta protein, I make these plaques all over my brain, and I short-circuit my nerve cells, so I can't think properly, and I can't remember what I said 5 minutes ago or whom I met on the street. There are now treatments. So we encourage people who are worried about Alzheimer's to be evaluated and to enter a trial. Now, the treatments are experimental, which means that they're not approved by the government yet, and they're all experimental. That means when you come to one of our trials, you don't have to pay for your care. You don't have to pay for the drug. It's all done by a company together with academic neurologists and psychiatrists and geriatricians, and we give you an experimental drug. And the last thing I want to tell you before I start taking your questions is that a month ago in Nice, France, I went over. Polly was supposed to go, but she decided she was too busy with the affairs of the town of Brookline to join me, which is good. She's working for you, the taxpayers. And I went by myself, and I heard a remarkable presentation by a company called Biogen. Biogen is a company in Cambridge and elsewhere around here, and they've become one of the most successful biotech companies. And they presented data from an experimental trial they did where they gave people a shot in the arm once a month. And every month you went, and we participated in this trial at the Brigham, at the Mass General, where I work, and we gave people a shot in the arm of an antibody. Now, have you heard the word antibody before?
Yes.
Antibodies, right. So you know that antibodies are something that you make to a foreign invader, to a bacterium or to a virus. But we figured out how to make antibodies to the clasp of the pen, the amyloid beta protein. And we did that early on. My lab actually made the first such antibodies in history, and then many companies developed their own antibodies in even better ways than we could do in an academic lab. And Biogen developed an antibody to the clasp of the pen, and they injected it once a month, and after 12 months, the level of the amyloid plaques went down dramatically in the person's brain, in the Alzheimer's patient's brain. And most importantly, they were not as forgetful. In fact, they were entirely stable for 12 months, which is not what my Alzheimer's patients do. They decline gradually, and they get more forgetful over time. So in summary, there now are experimental treatments, not yet approved, so you can't just go down to Walgreens or CVS and buy them, that slow down the buildup of these amyloid plaques and seem to help your thinking, seem to stabilize your thinking, because our Alzheimer's patients don't just stay the same for a year. And our next step is to do a much bigger trial of hundreds, even thousands of people. And Biogen's not alone. They have competitors around the world, which is how it should work. They're also trying to be the first across the finish line to get an antibody that helps Alzheimer's. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. I'm going to remind you that you need to keep your minds active by doing physical exercise and mental exercise as much as you can. I'm going to remind you that next time around, choose your parents very carefully. And then I'm going to remind you that since so many of you, certainly I suspect most of you in this room, age gracefully and can enjoy the Brookline Senior Center and can do a lot of things and enjoy your children, your grandchildren, your friends, that's all for the good. But if you or your loved ones find that you're not so sharp anymore, then you need to see a specialist who can tell you whether or not you're on the track to Alzheimer's. And if you are, we want to give you a drug like the one that Biogen is testing. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to have you think a little bit about what I've said and see if you have any questions about anything that has to do with the aging of the mind. Yes?
How do you quiet your mind? I'm sorry for racing. I'm not, you're talking about using it, I'm talking about racing.
Right. So first thing is you ask your wife not to nag you. That's very important.
Does she listen?
She listens sometimes. When my mind is really racing, that happens. I'm just kidding. The truth of the matter is you need to sit quietly and perhaps meditate or do yoga or engage in Tai Chi. Thank you. Thanks for giving me a heads up. And so I should have looked at the program. I would have figured that out. So the, meditation, relaxation, resting a little bit, lying in the sun for a few minutes quietly, those things can really slow down the mental racing. And what I tell many of my patients who don't have Alzheimer's but are worried that they're forgetful is if you can do 3% less per day than you normally would, or 5% less, and they say, well, that's not very much, I can give up 3% of my daily activities, then that can be very helpful to keep your mind from racing. Just do a little less than you normally would. Other questions? Yes?
How does the quantity of amyloid before the trial, during the trial, after the trial?
Good. So this is a question right up my, so the question was, how does the quantity of amyloid in the person's brain get changed, or how much does it change before and during and after the trial? And that's been figured out. And in the first 3 months of the trial, you can't notice any change in the level of amyloid in the person's brain. We see this by PET scanning, it's called. And then by 6 months, you can already see a bit of a decline, and it's dose dependent. It depends on how much of the antibody you injected. So 3 milligrams or 10 milligrams, etc. And then by 12 months, there's a big decline. And in the largest dose that this particular trial that Biogen did used, which was 10 milligrams, the level of the amyloid fell all the way down to almost the normal low level that people would have in their brain. Oh, with a PET scan, with an amyloid PET scan that you lie down in a machine and it tests you. Yes?
Being able to ask questions succinctly is a healthy sign. I hope I can do it. Is there?
I'm going to repeat the question, don't worry. Yeah.
Are there any studies out there, or does your knowledge have any input on the notion as to whether having an emotionally positive attitude towards life versus being depressed and having a negative attitude affects aging?
Yes. So the question is whether having a positive attitude towards life versus a negative one affects aging. And the answer is yes, to some extent. So there's little doubt that having a positive outlook and not being clinically depressed is good for health, generally. It's good for cardiovascular health, it's good for orthopedic health, it's good for many things. And so Tai Chi or relaxation and various things that lift your spirits and make you more relaxed, those are for the good. On the other hand, if we talk about Alzheimer's disease, people who've been depressed much of their lives intermittently through no fault of their own, they have a genetic tendency or a medical tendency to be depressed, and they may have been treated, they get Alzheimer's disease. But people who've been very buoyant and happy all their lives, they get Alzheimer's disease too. And there's very little difference between the two. So the answer to your question, sir, is that having a positive spirit is always a good thing and carries you through life's hurdles, but it doesn't cancel out the biological imperative of a gene, let's say, that causes someone to have Alzheimer's. It won't help you with that. And we find that people who have Alzheimer's, if they've been depressed intermittently much of their life, they sort of still look a little bit depressed. And if they've been brilliant most of their life, they still look happy, even though they're losing their memory with Alzheimer's. Yes, in the back.
If you suspected a problem, what kind of doctor should you go to? A neurologist, a psychologist? What specialty should you look for?
Right. So the question is, if you suspect there's a problem with the aging of your mind and you're a little worried that things aren't right, what kind of doctor should you consult? And the answer almost certainly is the doctor who's closest to you. That would be your internist or your general practitioner or your geriatrician, someone who really knows you. You would first start with that doctor and say, you know, my daughter says that I've been forgetful. I don't really notice it. I think I'm fine. I'm the same as all the other people I meet. But she says that there's something wrong. So you go first to the doctor that knows something about your health. Is there anyone in this room that doesn't see a doctor at all? I'm glad to hear it. All right, so that would be the first choice. And then if your doctor says, you know, Mary or Bob, I think there is something a little wrong, and we probably need to send you to someone who does this all the time. I do everything in medicine. There are people who just specialize in this. And that would be essentially three kinds of doctors: a psychiatrist, a neurologist, or a geriatrician, geriatric medicine specialist. Those are the people who tend to see folks who may have Alzheimer's or something like that. Psychologists could be helpful. Psychologists can help you with many aspects of psychological health, but they're not the individuals who would prescribe a medicine or necessarily bring you into a trial. So you need to see a neurologist, psychiatrist, or geriatrician. I would nominate neurologists first because I am one. All right, other questions? A few minutes left. Yeah. Yes?
What kind of mental exercise do you recommend as far as games and solitaire and those kinds of things go?
Well, I have a very highfalutin consultant who tells me that that Words with Friends is one of the very best ones. That's what I understand. Words with Friends is a game that looks like Scrabble on a pad. You can do it on an iPad, etc., and you can play it with your friends. But this requires you to go to the computer lab, one floor down below, and get a little familiar with an iPad or a computer so you can play Words with Friends, even with friends who live in Santa Barbara or somewhere far away. So that's very good, but you know, there are many other games. You know, it's probably more whatever you like, and there are games online now that companies are trying to make a lot of money with. One of the brand names is called Luminosity, and I don't have any real evidence that one is better than the other. Yes?
So you've mentioned a lot of things, and I just wanted to know, what about socialization? How important is that in later years?
So the question is socialization, and I did mention at the beginning that that's terribly important. So physical exercise, mental exercise, and the mental exercise is often in the context of being with friends, talking with them, playing bridge with them, that kind of thing. So I think socialization is enormously important, which is why it's so exciting to visit the Brookline Senior Center. A couple more questions. Yes? So, yes, so the lady is asking about dominant hemisphere in the brain. There's, most of us have the left hemisphere, the left half of the brain that's dominant, which is why we throw with the right hand, most of us, or deal with the right hand. Some of us have a right hemisphere dominant. And the question is whether if you write with your non-dominant hand, if you write with the wrong hand, so to speak, if I write my name with my left hand, is that good for my brain? And the answer would be yes. It wouldn't keep you from losing your memory. It wouldn't keep you from getting Alzheimer's disease. It wouldn't do any of that. But if you ever, God forbid, had a stroke in the left side of the brain, having trained your right side of the brain to do a lot of things would be helpful, potentially. And one of the things people do in treating people with strokes is if they have a paralysis of one hand, they tie the good hand behind the person's back in a sling. And then they have to work with their bad hand, which they don't really want to do, because if I have a bad hand, I'd much rather work with my good hand and pick it up. So there is some learning that the brain can do in that regard. Yes?
Is there any truth to, like, if a parent had Alzheimer's, that you are subject to Alzheimer's?
Yes, so the question is, if a parent had Alzheimer's, does that make you subject to it? And the answer is not automatically, the way it works is that if you had one parent with Alzheimer's and no other relatives with Alzheimer's, the condition is so common in society that we don't think of that as a real problem. We don't think that that's contributing to your risk, because a lot of people have relatives with one person having Alzheimer's in a family, because this is a disease that affects 6 million Americans, 40 million worldwide, and that's not counting the 2 times as many as that that are on their way to getting Alzheimer's but don't know it yet. So there are probably 120 million people. So one parent wouldn't be enough to make you terribly worried. If your parent and your grandparent, let's say your mom and your grandmom, they both had Alzheimer's, then you would begin to become more concerned, because in about 30% of Alzheimer's cases, it does tend to run in families. That is, it's genetic. And then you go to a specialist, first your doctor, then to a specialist like a neurologist, and they'll go over your family history, and they'll decide, is this worrisome or not? The worst possible case, and it's bad, if you had a strong family history of Alzheimer's, the worst case would be a 50% chance that you'd get it, not a 100% chance. So it's very important to say that. Let's say you had a family history of Alzheimer's. The worst genetic chance is 50%, unless you had it extremely rare that you had it absolutely equally on both sides of the family, which doesn't hardly ever happen. So 50% is the worst, and 30% is the general rate of Alzheimer's genetically. So you wouldn't want to worry about it, and forget about the fact that you didn't choose your parents carefully. It's not that important. I'm going to stop in 1 or 2 minutes, otherwise I'll get the hook. Is there one more question, and then we're going to stop? Yes, ma'am. Good, thank you. That was a great last question. Dementia and Alzheimer's, what's the difference? Dementia is a general term that, like the word implies, means dementing or going away from mental ability. So less mental ability. It's just a general term. Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia. And it's like headache. Headache is a general term, and lots of different kinds of headaches. And migraine is one type of headache. And it's the same thing there. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention and see you again.
Okay, now you're here to actually learn what is happening in the field of nutrition research. And I want to say this basket here that Nick put together is a really good example of some of the good foods that I'll be wanting you to think about eating. So you can come up afterwards and take a peek, but I might highlight some of them. And I'm glad that I'm coming right after you had a demonstration of physical exercise, because while I'm going to speak about nutrition, it turns out there's even more evidence right now, because it's easier to do clinical trials in exercise than it is in nutrition, that we have a lot of clinical trial evidence that physical exercise will really help protect your brain, both in reducing your risk of brain diseases, not just Alzheimer's, but general cognitive decline. And also, if you already have a problem, it looks like it helps slow it down. There's lots of good studies. It also, of course, elevates your mood, helps you relax, lessens anxiety. So physical exercise is really amazing, helps, of course, your heart. But did you know it helps? There's a part of your brain called the memory center, the hippocampus, that in Alzheimer's starts shrinking. And one of the few things you can do to help it increase in size and create new neurons in the hippocampus is physical exercise. I think that's amazing. And this A-beta, I'm going to tell you a lot of foods that help reduce A-beta, but guess what? Physical exercise does too. And I think it's just amazing. You know, we are meant to move. That's how we're built. And I also wanted to honor Alan Balsam here with the Department of Public Health. Are you still #1? Yeah. So I'm an honor to...
I aspire to be #1, but...
Well, you're #1 in my book. So again, Alan's been in this work decades like me. So I'm thrilled to be in the presence of such wonderful people. Okay, now, what's really happening in the world of nutrition, I've been in this work for about 15 years, inspired by actually my mentor, Dr. Walliser, who's a geriatric psychiatrist. We both thought that it will take, Alzheimer's is such a tough disease that it's really going to take what we call a multi-component or multi-domain effort to really protect your brain. So it's exercise, nutrition. You heard parts of this from Dennis Selkoe. Important to be socially engaged. If you're going to do anything with mental exercises, if you do it with another person, you get a twofer. The same if you do your physical exercises with a friend or another person or in a group. The brain really thrives on conversation and being with other human beings. That's how we're made. There's actually 11 different evidence-based lifestyles. Now, so my initial efforts in research was to try to get funded for multi-domain trials. I wasn't successful because I was too soon in the game. People didn't believe that was the best way to go about figuring out if lifestyles would be helpful. But now we actually have younger people in the field, and I have to say it's wonderful to be part of an international community. I founded the Alzheimer's Disease International 31 years ago, along with a few other people. And now, really, some of the leadership in this whole field of nutrition and protecting the brain and other lifestyles to protect the brain is really coming from outside the U.S. We got some stars in the U.S., but outside the U.S., we got much more activity and funded clinical trials going out, and they're now starting to report positive results. So if you were wondering, is it worth your time to listen to what Dennis said or I am saying about exercise and nutrition? Yes, because now we have proof, because the gold standard is clinical trials. We got, my program is based on hundreds of studies. Some of them are animal studies, but mice aren't. Where an animal study typically would be, let's see if we have mice develop, we inject genes into their embryos so they have an Alzheimer-like disease. We feed them different specific foods and see what happens. And these are really useful because it shows you the mechanisms by which food might be helpful. So right here in Boston, James Joseph led the way with, he fed his mice blueberries, and he tried spinach, he tried strawberries, and every time he picked a food that we would say is healthy, guess what? It helped those mice. It slowed down their decline into dementia. It decreased the amount of A-beta in their brain, which is one of the problem proteins. It's not the whole story. And it also improved, of course, their physical activity and their heart health. So little by little with these mice studies where they looked at a whole bunch of different foods, we get a lot of evidence that way. Other people looked at nuts like walnuts and almonds, melatonin. Every time they looked at a healthy food, it helped these mice. So that gives you a clue. But mice aren't us. And the type of Alzheimer's they're given is that really rare type that Dennis mentioned where half the family develop it. He didn't mention, but it's usually in your 40s or 50s. That's why you know it's in your family, because people get ill so early in life. Okay, so that's one kind of evidence. Another kind is we have, like, let's say, I don't know how many people are here, but 75 or 100. Let's say there were 2,000 of us, and we got interviewed once a year. How many of you are in any of these studies where you go into a medical center and they do tests and they maybe interview you every year or every 5 years? Any of you in any of those studies? Okay, we have one person here. Boston is famous for the nurses study, the physician studies, and then we have our HOPE study at BU. There are many of these studies where people are tested every so often. And one of the things you can ask people is, what did they eat? What have they been eating on average? There's a certain way to do that called the food frequency questionnaire. So that's really good. A lot of helpful information has come from these surveys where we talk to people and then we find out years later was there a relationship between what people ate and whether they developed cognitive problems or full-blown Alzheimer's. And one of the newest studies that just came out is called the MIND study by Martha Claire Morris. Did anyone hear about that? And earlier, a whole bunch of studies by the group at Columbia looking at the Mediterranean diet. these type of studies are very clever because instead of just looking at individual foods like eating fish, would that help your brain, lots of studies were able to say, yeah, it looks like there's an association. Well, the clever thing was to look at a whole dietary program by giving points to people. So let's say if you, for the Mediterranean diet studies, if you ate lots of olive oil, you got a point. If you drank wine, you got a point. If you ate more than the average amount of animal food, whether it was poultry or red meat, you lost a point. Or you got a point if you ate less than the average. And then, so things like that. If you ate beans and lentils, you got a point. If you ate lots of vegetables, you got a point. So they could add them all up and have a score. Even if people weren't from the Mediterranean, you could have a score in this Mediterranean diet test. So that was starting to develop associations between whole dietary programs and people's chances of getting cognitive problems or Alzheimer's. And then they also looked, if you already had Alzheimer's, how did it affect you? And they were able to show that people who ate better lived a lot longer. They didn't have enough people in the study to see if it actually improved their thinking, but the thought was that it probably did. Okay, then most recently, once that idea was out there, then other researchers looked at other diets. So somebody looked at the DASH diet, which is any of you follow that? It's a blood pressure, heart health type diet. So people who followed that actually had less risk of getting Alzheimer's. And then most recently, the MIND diet, which combined some ideas in the Mediterranean diet with the DASH diet and with this particular researcher's own studies over the last 10 or 15 years. So that's one way, but that's only association. That's only, like, what if everybody that drank olive oil also did exercise every day? So you don't know till you do a clinical trial what the real story is. So what's exciting is we're now getting clinical trial evidence. Now the first study, the biggest study that was done, reported out from Finland last July, and the formal article was just published by a young female physician named Mia Kiva-Pelto. She's gorgeous, she has a family, and MD, PhD, she's brilliant, and she did all the hard work. She did her cohort studies like the type I just described. Then she believed, like I did years ago, and she was able to get funding from the Finland Department of Public Health. See, in Europe, the government, you pay taxes, the taxes cover all of your health care. So it's everybody's incentive, has the incentive to keep people well. That's the way it really should work. So the Department of Public Health wants to try health promotion programs, because if we could decrease the number of people getting Alzheimer's disease, it's a win-win. First, some of us wouldn't get it that would have otherwise, and second of all, there'd be fewer people having to care for them, and it would cost less money to the citizens, and so it balances out. Maybe you spend a little money on prevention, and you get a really big savings on the cost of health care. So this is why you see in Europe, whether it's Finland, Sweden, Germany, France, the UK, they're all putting money into Alzheimer prevention studies. So anyway, what did she do? She put together just what we were talking about: nutrition, she put physical exercise, she put in social engagement, keeping socially active, mental stimulation, and managing any issues you might have with heart health or with diabetes. And she had a coach for each one, because, like, some people can say do 30 minutes of exercise, but then where do you start? It's nice to be given a piece of paper, but isn't it better to go to a class or to have a fitness expert come to your home and, work out a program for you? And the same with nutrition, to give me menus, give me recipes, give me some coaching. So for each of these parts of the intervention, they did that. And it lasted 2 years. The control group got written information, but that was it, no coaching. And what happened at the end of the 2 years is that the people, just like we hoped, the people doing that intervention, first of all, most of them actually did something different. Now, some people did a lot of improvements and some did a little. But on average, everybody had better brain power at the end of the 2 years, very carefully measured all the different domains, memory, executive function, that's decision making, as well as speed of processing. So that was thrilling. Now, you might wonder, well, okay, so that's cool. If I do everything, I get better. And then the other study, but what about nutrition? How do we know nutrition itself is worth doing? Well, then we have to look to a different study, not as carefully designed from brain power point of view as the one in Finland, because they were all about, will this extra effort help save your brain? Because in another 7 years, they're going to look how many of the people in the study, and they were all, by the way, I think 60 to 75, and they were all judged to have a higher than average risk of Alzheimer's. Like Dennis mentioned, if you have certain particular genes, it kind of ups your risk, not like the rare families. But in 7 years, they'll see, did that really intensive effort help reduce the incidence of Alzheimer's disease in the intervention group compared to the control? So, okay, now back in Spain, for years, they've been doing this effort to help heart health and reduce risk of stroke. So it wasn't aimed at brain power. But luckily, the leader of the study, after the main study was designed and they had all these different hospitals across the country involved, he said, oh darn, other people in other countries are doing brain studies. We didn't think of that, because the brain is so connected to the heart health. So at least in one center that had 500 people, roughly, they were able to add some testing for the brain. And they got dramatic results for reduction of heart attack and stroke, first heart attack or first stroke in people who had all these heart disease risks but didn't have heart disease full-blown, like some had high blood pressure, some had high cholesterol, some had diabetes, some had all of that. And but to be in the study, you didn't have your first-time heart attack or stroke. And they were able, with their intervention, I'll tell you what it was, reduce the first-time heart attack and stroke by 30%. That's huge, 30%. And they were already on all the meds they could take, so this was on top of their medical management. So what was the intervention there? Well, it's Spain. They wanted to see, they first of all wanted to put the idea that eating a low-fat diet would help your heart. That was the control group. It really didn't work. The two interventions were to follow the Mediterranean diet, and they're already in Spain, so they're already eating better than we are. But they did something very clever. In order, what if you were designing a study and you wanted people to eat more nuts, what would you do? Would you just tell them to eat more nuts?
No, I put it out on the table.
Exactly. So what they did, they gave half of the five, what?
Add it to your food.
Yes. Okay. So what they did, that's another good suggestion. So what they did, besides giving them menus and recipes, they gave 2,500, this is a huge study, 7,500 people. They gave 2,500 people free nuts. Aha, see, give them, put it right in front of them. They gave them free nuts. And they gave them, what did they give them? They gave them 40 grams, that's about an ounce. If you ever go to Trader Joe's and they got those little packets of nuts all ready to eat, that's about that amount. And what kind of nuts did they choose? They chose, half of those nuts were walnuts. Why? Because they wanted them to definitely get more omega-3s into them. And walnuts are known to have the highest amount of omega-3s of our popular nuts. And then they gave, a quarter of them was almonds and a quarter was hazelnuts. They wanted to make sure they got some vitamin E and some other healthy, well, some calcium, but they were really aiming at healthy fats, and some extra antioxidants that are, all nuts are loaded with antioxidants. So healthy fats and antioxidants. Now, the other 2,500, guess what they would give them? Now, we're in Spain. And what do you think they might have given them? Olive oil, yes, because they wanted to see. Now, this is the first head-to-head trial of olive oil versus nuts, by the way. And was it just ordinary olive oil? No, because, of course, in Spain, most people use regular, cheaper olive oil to cook with. So what did they give them? Extra virgin. You know, and you could see the Department of Public Health had to work really hard with different growers of olives and all these nuts to get donations, right, to help keep the cost down of the study, because this is during the recession and Spain is managing to do this. They actually got the walnuts from California. Yay, California walnuts. Well, so they got extra virgin olive oil. How much did they give them? They wanted them to have 1/4 of a cup every day. They gave them a free liter every week. That was 1/4 of a cup. Of course, they used grams and fluid ounces there. I mean, not ounces, because it's Spain, they use the metric system. 1/4 of a cup. So they gave them plenty of extra virgin olive oil, enough to cook for the whole family. Because if I only gave them enough for themselves, well, they're going to share, right? Then they wouldn't get the amount that I wanted as a researcher to get inside their body. And they even could test afterwards. They would do blood draws or urine tests to make sure they were actually eating what they gave them. They could tell that. So they had very good compliance, because who wouldn't want to have the higher quality olive oil? And who wouldn't want to eat nuts if they're right in front of you? And they could put them in their food and all that. So what they found was the ones given the free olive oil ate the free olive oil. The ones given the free nuts, they ate the free nuts 6 days out of 7 days. So that was a huge increase. What they did the 7th day, maybe they gave it to their neighbor or the dog, I don't know. But anyway, the ones given the free olive oil, however, didn't increase their consumption of nuts, because they're kind of pricey. So what they found out was that the big story was, whether you had olive oil or nuts, you did way better on reducing, both of them reduced heart attack and stroke risk by 30%. Didn't matter whether you got the olive oil or the nuts. So the two are like in the race together. Then they started looking at this smaller set of 500 people. They had 500 people where they did post-tests of their cognition, and they were able to show, and again, they were randomly assigned to those 3 groups. The ones that had either nuts or olive oil had better cognitive tests at the end than the ones in the control group. So that was the first news released about a year ago. And just last month, they actually had managed, because there was such a long period of recruitment, this guy's idea to test for brain power started in the middle of this, kind of 1/3 of the way into the study. So they actually had some baseline testing. This is what you really want, is how did they change from the beginning to you know, over a period of time, individual people, did their brain power improve? And they found, yes, it did. So it further, the numbers were small. They only had about 125 people in each of these groups. But they found that the nuts, if I got it right, the nuts helped better, both nuts and olive oil were helpful, just like they showed earlier. But it was interesting, they helped in different ways. The olive oil was a star in helping frontal cognition. That's more like your decision making and your planning. And the nuts were better at helping your memory, which is what the studies with the animals had shown, that would help with your memory. So the bottom line from that study is eat both nuts and olive oil, okay? And the olive oil is really interesting, because it's not just the healthy fats in it. They found that why you need it to be extra virgin, spend the extra money, because the extra virgin means it's a first squeezing. Now what happens in that olive oil is you got the antioxidants from the olives, okay? So you want those antioxidants from the olives. That's why we recommend, now I've given you some of the clinical trial evidence, but I see I need to quickly summarize what other foods do you need to eat based on all the studies. Number 1, increase, I don't know how many people here are vegan. Anybody vegan? Raise your hand. Okay, so we have one vegan. So if you're vegan, then one of the first thing I'm going to say is you need to have more fish and seafood in your diet. If you're vegan, your goal is to get more omega-3s. So you can do it through flaxseed, but also algae and seaweed, and there's actually omega-3s made from algae. So that's what you would need to do. That's very important. Another thing, you want to increase the amount of beans and lentils in your diet. Some people's ethnic background, they're used to eating beans and lentils. Others, not so often. So if you can get beans and lentils into your diet, I'd say anywhere from 3 to 5 times a week, that would be great. It doesn't have to be a whole lot, but you can figure out ways to do it, and they're one of the cheapest foods we have if you cook them from scratch. You could cook a big pot of beans one day and eat it off it the rest of the week. Or if you buy canned beans, then be sure you rinse them and get rid of the salt, which they're loaded with salt. There are low sodium beans that are easier to work with. Okay, so that's beans and lentils. I've already said nuts, but you can also add seeds. They didn't happen in that study to look at seeds, but seeds are every bit as powerful as your nuts. Remember, it's the whole plant. That the nuts and seeds have the ability to create a whole plant, so you want to eat it. Now, what they didn't look at, the rest of the Mediterranean diet also emphasizes green leafy vegetables. And there's many, many studies, not just ones related to Mediterranean diet, but many, many studies show us of all the vegetables, and I want to urge you to really, if you want to save your brain, vegetables are, besides nuts and beans and lentils and fish, it's vegetables that are going to help save your brain. And a lot of Americans just don't eat many vegetables anymore. And so you really, whether you eat salads or whether you have cooked vegetables, most Asians cook all their vegetables, and I like that actually because you can eat more volume that way. Spinach, you could take a whole pile of spinach and it boils down to nothing. I mean, boils, I saute it usually with olive oil. Now, any vegetable you can add olive oil to and it improves the flavor. Okay, so vegetables, and the star among all your, I would have a variety. I'd have some root vegetables, I'd have some leaf vegetables, and I would have some fruit vegetables like zucchini and eggplant and that kind of thing. Well, but the leaf vegetables are the star. So figure out which ones you like and eat a lot more of them. There are some products out there, if you hate your vegetables, that you can take some pills, but it's really hard, like Juice Plus, but it's really hard to get enough volume into you. And I work with my son-in-law. He's 3/4 Italian. You'd think he'd love his leafy greens. He didn't. But I discovered, I worked with him, what flavors did he like? He loves balsamic vinegar. So I said, we'll put balsamic vinegar on whatever green, and now he eats them. So Tom, and he said to me, Nancy, I'm depending on you to save my brain. And I said, Tom, only you can save your brain. I can give you advice, but only you can make the changes. So we worked that out. He was also eating some unfortunate foods for breakfast. And I'll get to them in a minute because they're some of the foods you need to avoid. Okay, so other stars. Okay, fruits. Among the fruits, berries are your best bet. There's so much studies done, not just on blueberries and strawberries, but every berry you can think of is great for your brain. They're very anti-inflammatory. You'll see that one of my whole strategies is you want an anti-inflammatory diet. And berries are the best that way. Also for nutrition, they pack the most nutrition in the smallest package, calorie-wise and even volume-wise. So that it's easy, like when you don't have much appetite, they taste great, and they're just loaded with good things for your body and your brain. So berries. Now all fruits are good, but I'm just saying berries of all the fruits are the best, and you also need to limit how much sugar you're taking in. So if you ate fruit all day and no vegetables, you get into trouble. You really want more vegetables and then, a certain amount of fruit. And let's see. Then spices and herbs are the other key thing. And I'll take questions in just a second. So you want spices and herbs. Why? They're loaded with, they're very powerful antioxidants, and many of them are anti-inflammatory as well, especially like turmeric, ginger, oregano, rosemary. Whatever your taste, you can find a powerful anti-inflammatory herb. They also have no calories. They improve the flavor of your food. So if you're trying to cut down salt and sugar, your best friend are your herbs. And some of you live near a Trader Joe's. We recommend their 21 seasoning salute. They only charge $2 for their herbs and spices. The other spice that is a star is cinnamon. A lot of people like it. It will help reduce your blood sugar, reduce your cholesterol, and help remove A-beta from your brain. Believe it or not, that was a study done with mice. And then ginger and turmeric are other real stars for brain and body health. Okay. And then, okay, what foods do you need to avoid? And Martha Morris agrees with me on these foods, and she gives actually a target of saying not more than once a week. One would be animal saturated fats. The ones that we know most about are butter and cheese. So like she said, I think for butter to limit it to 1 tablespoon a day, because butter isn't all bad. It's pretty pure food. But you want to, if you're going to take in saturated fats, take them in from the plant kingdom. Plants have, we don't have to worry about cholesterol content, but the plant fats are just healthier in general than the animal fats. So you can get your saturated fat from palm oil and from coconut oil and from all these nuts and seeds that I hope you'll be eating. And then, so you want to keep your animal foods, the red meats, down to no more than once a week. Your fast foods, you're going to try to avoid processed foods as much as possible because they're just full of bad actors. So she actually was very specific and said fast foods or fried foods no more than once a week. And she comes down hard on cheese. I'm not so hard on cheese because it's a fermented food and I like fermented foods. So she says cheese once a week. I'd say maybe once or twice. And the main bad actor that she doesn't mention as much because it wasn't in any of the studies. All these studies, they didn't really try to single out sugar. But you've been hearing over the news over the last 10, 15 years, and the news keeps getting worse and worse. But the thing you really want to reduce drastically is the amount of sugar in your world. If it's natural, if it's in a whole food like a fruit or a root vegetable like a sweet potato or carrot, those are great for you because they're loaded with nutrition and antioxidants that counter the problem of any sugar in them. And we're meant to have a certain amount of sugar, but do you know Americans today are eating 50 times the amount of sugar that we did just 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And it's because we partly were on this low-fat craze, and what did they replace the sugar, fat with was salt and sugar, and they're both worse for us, it turns out, than the fat. It was based on faulty evidence. Who knew? But anyway, you really want to, if you avoid processed food, you're automatically going to avoid your sugar. And we go with the American Heart Association that says no more than like 7 teaspoons of added sugar a day. And that's a lot, but you can get that in 1 soda. So really stick with water as your drink. Now I'm going to take, that gives you an overview. You got my handout. We'll be downstairs for additional questions, but I'll take a few questions now. I have, I think, just 5 minutes. Yes? Yeah. Well, honey is a form of sugar. Now, if you're going to take in any kind of natural sugar, you want to keep the amounts down. But at least honey is a natural. But a lot of honey that's sold today is processed. You want, if you're going to have honey, make it raw honey. It's more expensive, harder to find, but it has half the glycemic index. There is, folks, I really want you to know, there's a close relationship between having too much sugar and having diabetes and prediabetes or insulin resistance and having brain problems. The brain lives on sugar and it wants it in tiny, tiny doses. If you overwhelm it with the amount of sugar we're taking in, it actually starts damaging your brain, and it shrinks that memory center, that hippocampus. Sugar and starches and like refined grains that your body turns into sugar, it shrinks your memory center. And the only way around it is to eat the healthier foods and exercise. You can do so much damage to your brain with too much sugar. So we have downstairs, we do suggest, luckily now there are natural non-sugar sweeteners available. Truvia is one, stevia is in a lot of the products, it's very safe. And then there's some other companies using monk fruit. So there are a lot of natural sweeteners that have no sugar in them. Now, if you're going to use a real sugar like honey, use raw sugar, raw honey, or use coconut sugar as one of the hottest new products on the consumer market. It has the lowest glycemic index, which means it aggravates your sugar metabolism the least. Of all the true, it's a true sugar, so it has calories and it counts as a sugar, but it doesn't interfere with your body as much as the others. And it tastes great. So we have some of that if you want to sample what it tastes like. Doesn't taste like coconut at all. Yes?
What's your take on organic versus non-organic?
Very, very good question. Thank you. All these are good questions. My caution is if you get too worried about organics, you'll be afraid of eating food. So well, because organics are very expensive and some people have limited budgets. And I really believe in the power of our produce to help us out. So what I would do is I look at the list of Dirty Dozen and include, say, strawberries. If you eat one of those food that it has especially high levels of pesticides, and you eat it every day, then I would go for organic. Like I had a friend that ate strawberries every day. He should get organic strawberries. If you eat kale every day, organic kale. But if you eat apples, if you ate an apple every day, organic apples. But if you ate apples once or twice or 3 times a week, I emphasize variety, because in variety, first of all, we're getting a whole bunch of nutrients. We still don't know exactly which nutrients each cell in our body needs, each organ needs. If we eat a variety, you're not only assuring a better, let's say, supply of rich nutrients, but you're also kind of evening out your danger of getting too much of any one toxin. That's Nancy's theory anyway. Alan might have something to say. And then like for fish, the ones that are high in mercury, don't eat them more than once a week, like tuna. But guess what? Sardines are one of the healthiest and least expensive fish. So convenient for a senior. You can buy those tins for not very much money, and anytime you need an entree, you can eat them plain or you can make a salad with them. The same with the canned Alaskan salmon from Trader Joe's and other places. I just made myself the most delicious salmon salad. It's in one of our recipe books. A salmon, avocado, a bunch of chopped up vegetables and parsley, some sunflower seeds, and wow. And you've got a meal that, you got leftovers too. It was wonderful. Yes, there was another question there.
I heard that vitamin E is associated with good brain health.
Yes.
And also it has negative effects as well. What amount of vitamin E should?
Very good question. She's asking about vitamin E. Now, vitamin E is one of these tricky areas where the early studies done for heart health were actually misguided. They used a tremendous amount, 2,000 international units, and these were in people who were very ill with heart problems, and they only used, most of them, the studies were synthetic, and they used alpha tocopherol, and they weren't aware, maybe, that vitamin E is actually a complex. I call it the family of 8. You may never have heard this. Alpha, gamma, beta, alpha, gamma, beta, delta, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, there we go. Tocopherols, and the same with tocotrienols. There's 8 different forms of vitamin E. For the brain, you actually need the gamma and some of the tocotrienols to protect your brain. Every single brain cell in your head, if it's healthy, has some vitamin E molecules actually sticking in the membrane to prevent oxidation of the omega-3s that your brain cell is made out of. You probably didn't know that. Your brain cells are in danger of becoming, fishy. So you want to protect them with the vitamin E, and the vitamin C helps the vitamin E do its work. So if you're going to get any vitamin E, first of all, you can get a lot of it from your food if you eat a lot of nuts and seeds and leafy green vegetables. It's in a lot of foods, but you want a variety, and actually palm oil is the best commercial source of the rare tocotrienols. But if you're going to buy any supplements, only buy the ones that have they'll say on the label, mixed tocopherols and tocotrienols, and you only need like 200, 400 international units. They still use the amount of alpha tocopherol as how they measure the strength, but you don't need much. If you bought a 400 international unit version, you could have it every other day. But the key is to have high levels of all kinds of vitamin E, and forget the mega doses. And when we did the study with Alzheimer patients, they actually used the 2,000 international units, and it did not hurt them. They did not have higher mortality rates. It actually helped the situation. So let's, this gentleman here.
One of the problems of having salad is we get salad dressing. And you go to low-calorie salad dressing, most of that is tasteless.
Right. Yeah, actually there's some on my website, brainwellness.com, and in my recipe books. Basically, here's the easiest way to make a salad dressing, and if you don't like this flavor, you can try adding some other things. But basically, you start with extra virgin olive oil, you use some kind of vinegar, whatever your favorite vinegar is, and then you put in some 21 seasoning salute, and maybe a little garlic powder. Shake it all up, and you can keep it in the refrigerator for a couple of weeks. And if you like more of the creamy type, you can use some canola-based mayonnaise. You can add a little, a healthier ketchup. I mean, there are different ways you can make the other types. But if this is something you want to know more of, you can contact me, and I'll get you some recipes. The lady in green. Sugar alcohol, that's what erythritol, there's a lot of sweeteners that are called sugar alcohols. And I realize I always tend to look to the right, so I want to see if there are any questions here. But sugar alcohol is not a sugar. It's chemically similar, but it's different. So it doesn't act as a sugar in your body. It's got an alcohol part of it, an OH, and it's a lot of them are sweet. So there's mannitol, sorbitol, and then there's erythritol is a little safer for humans to use. That's why Truvia puts it in their product, because it's less likely to give you the runs. If you ate a lot of xylitol, like you can have a little bit of it, and it's in dental gums, because all the sugar alcohols actually help your teeth. They're bug killers. They actually help protect your teeth. That's why dentists recommend like xylitol. But they do not act like sugar in the body. And erythritol looks and tastes like a weak form of sugar, so they're kind of fun. Yes?
I usually mix banana, apple, variety of berries, pineapple, and then green leafy vegetables, with cold water, and make it a smoothie. Is that correct?
Yes, that's great. She's suggesting making smoothies. How many of you tried that? And it's, okay, so some of you have. And it's a good idea. Let's say you hate vegetables, like my son-in-law. Another way to get more greens into you, the leafy greens, is to make a smoothie where half of it's fruit. You might put in some yogurt for the protein. Yogurt I recommend because it's fermented and we need that. Where that's the cutting edge of nutrition research is having a healthy gut. But I won't talk about that today. But this is another great way. Thank you for bringing that up. Any questions here, and then I need to close. Yes?
What do you think about fish oil supplement if I don't like fish?
Yeah, I heartily recommend fish oil supplements. I take a tablespoon of cod liver oil myself every day, lemon flavored. Cod liver oil has been around as a treatment for you know, helping boost our immune system. We know it's safe, and it has higher amounts of the DHA that's in our brain. A lot of vitamin A. Some pregnant women shouldn't take it because of the high vitamin A, but I don't think any of us are pregnant here. So, okay, one last question. I really got to close it off because it's lunchtime. Oh, you?
I just wanted to make a comment.
Yes.
My motto is everything in
Moderation. Good. I'd like to close with that. Everything in moderation. That'll help keep you out of trouble. Okay, here you go.
So, good afternoon and welcome to the special presentation. For those of you who I have not had the opportunity to meet, I'm Rhonda Gleiman, the Executive Director at Center Communities of Brookline. And on behalf of Center Communities and our parent organization, Hebrew Senior Life, it is my pleasure and honor to be here to introduce Dr. Jennifer Rhodes Croft. Dr. Rhodes Croft is the Medical Director of the Sloan Family Century Bank Primary and Specialty Care Center at Center Communities, just this way from the building at 100 Center Street. The Hebrew Senior Life Medical Practice opened in January of 2012, and it serves both Center Community residents and also seniors in the greater Brookline community. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Rhodes Croft as our medical director. After earning her Bachelor of Science at Duke, she went on to earn her MD at University of North Carolina Medical School at Chapel Hill. Yes, a Southerner. Dr. Rhodes, education-wise, anyway, we'll hear. Dr. Rhodes Croft holds a faculty academic appointment at Harvard Medical School, as well as appointments at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Hebrew Rehabilitation Center. She is the site director for the Harvard Medical School's Geriatrics Fellowship and is board certified in geriatrics, internal medicine, and palliative care. It is a pleasure working with her, and now it is my privilege to introduce you to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Jennifer Rhodes Croft. Please join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
Thank you for that nice introduction. It's really good to be here. Actually, I'm really a New Yorker. I lived in New York. I grew up in New York. Yeah, I know there's a lot of former New Yorkers, but I love the South, and I lived in the South too, so it's nice to live in different parts of this beautiful country. So this is meant to be informal. I've prepared some information here, so I make sure to cover what I think is most important for you to learn. I also gave out a very straightforward, brief handout, and you can always delve further on the internet and such, but that's a nice, brief, basic outline. The title of the talk is Diagnosis of Alzheimer's, How Do You Know It's Alzheimer's? And please feel free to ask any questions. I'm thinking, for the sake of time though, that I should probably have you hold your questions to the end, because I am going to try to cover a good amount of information, and I might even get to your question, but definitely feel free to ask questions at the end. And so just first to begin with, so I'm across the parking lot over there, and for my clinical hat, I have different hats because I do a lot of teaching too. And we left some information about our medical practice, and I specialize in taking care of seniors, and so I'm a geriatrician. And people who are thinking about cognitive issues may see a geriatrician or a neurologist, but geriatricians do a lot of management in this area. So if you want information about the practice, you can, Lisa will have a couple of things with that. Alrighty, so in terms of normal, what you might expect for normal changes in aging. Now, this is usually, there are some normal changes with aging in memory, but it's fairly subtle. And for instance, you might not be as good at remembering new names that you learn, or you might not be as good a multitasker. And it can also be the speed at which you are able to complete tasks. So a little bit of that is normal, but I want to tell you that it's just minor, it's very subtle. When there's more deficit than that going on, then it's important to talk to your doctor about it and get further evaluation. In terms of Alzheimer's, in terms of the incidence and prevalence, it actually is increasing because we've made incredible strides in some other areas of medicine like cardiovascular, oncology. So people are living longer and not passing from other diseases such as cardiovascular and cancer. So the incidence, prevalence of Alzheimer's is continuing to increase. So unfortunately, it is becoming fairly common and increasing with age. And in terms of diagnosis, so it actually is diagnosed, but a clinical diagnosis, okay? You can, this is the scoop on this. So most people feel that you can, in the majority of cases, do a really good job of diagnosing accurately. However, we've learned only recently that the accuracy of our diagnosing Alzheimer's has been overstated. There is recently a radioisotope test that you can get, and you have the radioisotope injected, it binds to amyloid plaque, and you get a PET scan. And actually, it's really incredible that this diagnoses Alzheimer's with 100% certainty. Now, the tricky thing about that is it is FDA approved, but Medicare has not voted yet to pay for it. So there are some people who elect to get it, but it costs about $1,000. So it's something to think about and be aware of. And it's particularly important because for research purposes, you could picture how it's hard to make strides in terms of developing a research drug that treats Alzheimer's when you're not even sure that the people that you're putting into this study actually have the correct diagnosis. So it's very exciting that we now have this way to be certain that the people that are in these research studies are the right people for that they do actually have Alzheimer's. So for today, I'm going to focus for you folks on when I'm wearing my geriatrician cap and I'm thinking about the person that's in front of me, what's the clinical assessment that I want to do to discern whether there's probable Alzheimer's. So let me go through that with you. Now, very key is obtaining a good history from the patient and also ideally from any family. And it's common that I might have a spouse or a daughter or son that come to an initial appointment, particularly when there's concerns about memory. And some of the questions that I'll ask is, when do you think you first noticed any memory changes? And what specifically have you noticed that is more difficult for you? And it is pretty incredible because about half of the patients, some of them are not even aware of it, and then the other half are. So when they're not aware, it's usually their spouse or their children that are bringing it to the attention of the physician. And then things that are subtle that can be helpful to ask about are you still able to do more complex tasks like cooking a meal? It's interesting, people can really compensate for each other, especially a husband and wife. They've been married forever, and she used to cook so well, and then suddenly the food started tasting very poorly. And so he took over, and maybe the family didn't even take note of that so much. Why was it that he took over the cooking? And so you want to ask some specific questions. It was the fact that she wasn't able to follow a recipe well anymore. Or it could be that she always paid the bills and a couple of rent checks were missed and he took over. But why really then that's something that maybe wasn't noticed at the time, but that's concerning that the person could no longer keep up with paying the bills on time. So the other thing is to see whether the decline is gradual. That's pretty classic for Alzheimer's, that it's a gradual decline. And then it's important for me to start thinking about excluding other causes of memory problems. And there's a fairly extensive list, but the most common ones that we think about, for instance, are vascular dementia, which is when you have blockages in your blood vessels, in your brain, and it could be very obvious if someone had a major stroke, but it can be more subtle. For instance, someone's had long-standing hypertension, they're more at risk for having little tiny small vessel disease changes. So it's important to look at the whole person and what other comorbidities they have that make them at risk maybe for a different type of dementia, like a vascular dementia. Or it is the case about 15% of dementias can be mixed, where you have Alzheimer's and vascular together. There's also Parkinson's that in later stages does lead to cognitive issues. There are some people that it could even be in the earlier stages, but that's important to think about as well. Lewy body dementia. There's a frontal lobe dementia where the front part of the brain has some atrophy. And then the other thing that I make sure to do, you don't want to miss anything that could be usually a contributor and not usually the main cause, but it could contribute to the memory to the person's memory not performing as well. So for instance, if someone has a depression, that's a really big issue that you do not want to miss. So you want to do a careful job of thinking, asking about the person's mood and going through some screening assessments about their, whether there could be depression, and talking to family.
That's a behavioral.
Depression could actually cause something called pseudo-dementia, where it can look like the person has dementia, but it's just because they're so depressed that it's impacting their memory, their very lack of interest in doing anything. That could be confused with Alzheimer's, for instance. But it is also the case that depression can present newly as foreshadowing to Alzheimer's. It does commonly occur that way also. So these things are complex to tweeze out, but that's why it's important to do a very careful history and try to sort things out as well as possible. Also, if people have had a stroke and they have a vascular dementia, about 60% of people have concurrent depression. So depression is a very important factor to not miss. The other thing is to check thyroid function. If someone's thyroid function is abnormal, that can contribute to poor memory. We also screen for vitamin B12 deficiency. There's something called normal pressure hydrocephalus that we might find some findings on exam, and we might do some imaging. And the one thing to say, it's not absolute that everyone should have brain imaging when they're having memory problems. It really depends on a discussion with the clinician of what they think is going on based on the clinical picture. But sometimes your physician might have you go for a CAT scan of the brain or an MRI of the brain. One thing that unfortunately is common, and definitely more so if people have dementia or Alzheimer's, is falls. And when you fall, you're at risk of hitting your head. And people, even if they don't have Alzheimer's, if you've had multiple head traumas, then that can cause dementia, memory impairment. And so you need to do a careful history about whether that's been going on. Some of the fall might just lead to like multiple concussions, but you could also have a bleed in your head that is very indolent and might not be noticed unless imaging was done. Like a subdural hematoma is what we call it, where you have some blood collecting there slowly. All right. Also, the other thing as a geriatrician I'm very careful about is a very good medication history, looking at have everyone bring their pill bottles each visit and look at their medications and see is there anything there that the side effects could be contributing to memory issues. So that's something to think about too. Alrighty. Now, in terms of disease progression, I just want to emphasize again, as I mentioned, that this can help tweeze things out. For instance, the Alzheimer's is a gradual, insidious progression, versus vascular dementia classically is more stepwise progression, meaning that there's some type of insult that happens in terms of the circulation of blood to the brain, where you might have a very tiny stroke. You may not even be aware of it, but it leads to the person having some cognitive deficit, and they could stay at that level for a long time, that plateau for a long time. And then another stroke occurs later, and then they're at a new lower plateau in terms of their memory function. And that's different than Alzheimer's, which is very gradual. Okay. So the instrument that is most commonly used and that I use as initial screening in my practice is called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, or the MoCA. And it's a brief assessment that is very helpful. It is very sensitive, meaning it is very accurate for picking up on memory problems. And most people, if they have a memory concern, they're usually, I ask them permission if they're okay with me asking them these questions, and they're agreeable, and then I'll go over it with them what the findings are. But it can help tweeze out, for instance, it is particularly sensitive for picking up some of the early signs of Alzheimer's. So what are some of the early signs? So the things we think about are language function, like finding the names for objects, finding the names for objects. The other subtle one is visual spatial. And it's very interesting because visual spatial tests, most people in their everyday, they're not needing to do these type of tests. But when I teach my students about this, I really show how this is a very good screening test, because we have people draw a clock or copy a cube, and it is remarkable because you can very easily spend a lot of time with someone and not pick up on that early deficit unless you do the screening test. So that is very, very helpful. And if there's an absent of a recent memory problem, then you really want to think about other causes of dementia, because Alzheimer's is the classic thing is that you're having problems with recent memory. Typical later signs of Alzheimer's dementia are executive function tests and behavioral symptoms. So as I mentioned earlier, when I do my initial good history taking, executive function tests are more complex things, following a recipe, bill paying. So you were driving, following directions. And then the other later thing you worry about is behavioral symptoms. But there can also be, nothing is exacting in terms of what course people follow, but I'm just giving you the typical disease trajectory. But you do worry if you're seeing some personality changes that can happen early to mid or moderate level of a cognitive dementia going on. So you want to ask people, have you noticed the person getting angry more easily or more anxious, or the depression part? Those can go hand in hand with the Alzheimer's. There is something, you could send a patient, or you can ask to get neuropsychiatric testing, which Medicare pays for about every 18 months if you wanted to go that often. And it's about a 90-minute assessment. So this is not for everyone. There are certain cases that could be helpful. That could be helpful, for instance, if someone does have a depression and you're really having a hard time tweezing out how much is the depression versus the dementia. Dementia. However, with the neuropsych testing, in terms of the different etiologies I mentioned, there is a lot of overlap in terms of the results on the test. So there's really, the other example that it could be helpful is for a person, particularly people that are very bright, they might perceive that they're having cognitive issues, but the test, the initial screening assessment, like the MOCA for instance, they're able to compensate, and I'm not able to pick up on their deficits, even though they're experiencing these deficits. So it could be really nice to go for the neuropsych testing, and they can see where the areas of weakness are, and are they truly there, or maybe the person, some people, they do just have anxiety and worry that they might be getting Alzheimer's. So that, and maybe it could end up being just a reassuring thing, but it also can emphasize where the person's strengths are. So that is important that can be helpful. The other thing to mention is a category called MCI, mild cognitive impairment. So there are a lot of people that fall into this, because if it's picked up at that early point, meaning pre-Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment, and not everyone will convert to Alzheimer's, but if it's, the idea is if you pick up on this group of patients where it's very mild, about 10 to 15% will convert per year to Alzheimer's. So just, you might hear that term MCI, so it's good to be aware of. All right, and then the other thing, I just want to go over the academic, like strict speaking criteria for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And then I just want to touch briefly on the medications that might be prescribed when people are thought to have Alzheimer's. So in terms of the criteria for probable Alzheimer's dementia, and I say probable because again I mentioned to you that we do the best we can to be clinically accurate in terms of diagnosing. But the gold standard really is to do this radioisotope imaging, PET scan. And so it's a PET scan, yeah. Okay, so in terms of 2 more minutes, okay, I'm closing up here. All right, so probable Alzheimer's dementia. So to meet the criteria, so what I was gonna say is, you might have mild cognitive impairment, but you can't, the person doesn't qualify for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's unless it interferes with ability to function at work and usual activities, a decline from a previous level of functioning and performing, and it's not explained by delirium or major psychiatric disorder. And then for the cognitive impairment needs to involve a minimum of 2 of the following domains: impaired ability to acquire and remember new information, impaired reasoning and handling of complex tasks, poor judgment. The third domain, impaired visual spatial abilities, which these screening tests I mentioned, impaired language functions, and changes in personality, behavior, and again, it needs to be insidious, a gradual progression. And then also a clear-cut history that things are worsening, okay? So I hope that's helpful to you. The reality is, unfortunately, in terms of what's available to us, in terms, there's not a cure. Even the medications that are available might help some people, but I try to set realistic expectations. The reality is that when you look at the research on Aricept or Namenda, some of these different medications that you've seen advertised, that the research is on this 70-point ADS-Cog, which is an instrument that assesses memory, and it includes asking the caregiver. You only see about 3 points improvement out of 70. So the chance that this will really be noticed is minimal. But there's argument that maybe there are certain people that really do respond. So, and it can be expensive, but if the patient and the family do feel like they want to try the medication, I'm very willing to have them try it. And if they think it's not helping them, we'll stop it. And it is well tolerated, but I have had side effect issues too. So like any medication, you have to be aware of what the side effects are and think about whether you would want to try it or not. Yes. And so on a high note, in terms of what I recommend to my patients and really recommend to anyone, are 3 components that can help, hopefully help progression, maybe slow progression, but also could be helpful prevention, but also help other parts of the body, which are thinking about staying very physically active and also thinking about making sure to be very socially engaged as much as you enjoy, and then keeping your mind mentally active. It's good you came to this talk today. Yes. So I'm pretty obsessive of when I see my patients to make sure that they're being as physically active as they can, and setting goals for such a thing, getting them help if they need help with physical activity, and living in a nice community helps with social engagement. And then the mental stimulation, you can think about whatever it is that stimulates you that you would enjoy. That's a really great thing to do. So can we do like a moment of questions? Okay. Is that okay? 1 more minute?
Maybe 1 or 2 because...
Okay, yes. All right, last minute.
Is there a special age that
I'm sorry, is there a special age? So in terms of, there's like less than 1% of Alzheimer's is genetic related, and that group is usually presenting like in 50s, 60s, but for the most part, people that present with Alzheimer's that are diagnosed, it's usually thinking about in the 80s age group, usually? Yeah.
Yes. I guess it's a two-part, very brief question. Are the cholesterol medicines bad for Alzheimer's, number one? And number two, are there foods which are good when you talk about activity?
Oh, food, diet?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've not heard about statins promoting Alzheimer's. There is some concerns in seniors that they could contribute to fatigue. So you have to weigh in with your doctor about whether to be on a statin overall. Does that make big picture sense for you? In terms of nutrition, I mean, good nutrition can only help in all ways. There's not good data to support that there's any specific nutrition that is keeping Alzheimer's away. But just in general, it's a good thing to do anyway, right? Yeah. Okay, so they're separate diagnoses entirely, but on the differential diagnosis, you want to think about if someone has dementia, could it be, if they have underlying Parkinson's, then it could be related to the Parkinson's that they have the memory issues, more likely than giving them another diagnosis like Alzheimer's. Yeah. Okay, so it is true that if someone has a low vitamin B12 level, that can affect their memory. But there are, as a separate note, some people have to be chronically on B12 supplement because their body maybe wasn't doing a good job absorbing it or such. But not everyone needs to be on vitamin B12. So it's something though that you would have your doctor do a screening test to discern. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
All of you are probably aware that Brookline is an age-friendly city, achieving that designation from the World Health Organization. And as part of that designation, in planning today's event, we asked the question, how can we also be an Alzheimer's-friendly community? When I heard the question, that's what made me want to invite my colleague, Cindy Allard, who has been the program director of our memory support programs at Goddard House, to come and speak with us to wrap up the day. Because Cindy, as I've gotten to know her as a colleague through the last 2 years, has been an utter champion for people who live with memory loss, and an utter champion in the sense that people who have dementia and Alzheimer's disease can, for as long as possible, lead a life that's engaged and meaningful. And part of that comes from them, and a great part of that comes from us, the rest of us in the community, people who do not have dementia, how we behave, how we react, how we include people with dementia. Cindy's worked across the continuum in elder care in every part of the aging field. She has a degree in recreation therapy from Northeastern University, and she also went back to school just a few years ago to get her BSN, her bachelor's degree in nursing. So here's Cindy Allard, my colleague, to present Building Blocks of Hope. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I don't know if anybody in this room knows anyone that has memory loss or dementia or Alzheimer's. Can you show me? Anybody know anybody? It's getting much more prevalent. I'm going to take this off. So today I'd like to talk about building blocks of hope. Can everybody still hear me? Okay. When thinking of what to talk about today, I thought it was best to talk about simple approaches to help you deal with the person with Alzheimer's and other related memory loss diseases. When I thought of that, a saying came to my mind. I think it describes it well. If you can't change the direction of the wind, adjust your sails. So that whole approach really boils down to putting the responsibility on us, as Ginny said, to change our behavior. as a person with memory loss cannot. So our approach is key, and to be present and shift our communication style so that we'll be more successful in connecting with that person. As one of my coworkers who was here today, Jeannie, told me after learning some new approaches, I changed my approach. Their response changed as well. I was able to connect with them. It was amazing and so meaningful. It was so much better, but yet so simple. So I'd like to give you some tips and tricks that I've learned over the years of dealing successfully with people with memory loss. Alzheimer's disease has so many devastating effects. People begin and focus on trying to find a cure. When people come to me, my focus is on the here and now, and very important to focus on the abilities, not to focus on the loss. I really like to focus on quality of life and help them to be the best they can be, to live and find joy. By adjusting my sail, I'm able to create positive interactions, elicit positive emotions, which lead to meaningful memories and create memories for our families. Each person has the ability to still give joy and receive joy and teach us how to live and to have a purpose. I find people with memory loss are very intuitive and are able to care for others. They are still able to develop and create relationships. They might not remember their names, but they still can connect and care for someone else. I have experienced so many tender and precious moments with staff and families. We always are touched by those moments when we're able to see into the windows of the residents' souls. We get a glimmer of who they are and who they were before this devastating disease. That's why we do what we do. The Alzheimer's Association teaches about the habilitation model, which focuses on every activity, and every interaction is an activity. The special events you do are the spices of your life. These interactions can be short, but meaningful and evoke a lot of emotions. Some communication tips that I'd like to go over with you. When you go up to somebody, you would look at them, maintain eye contact, say hello, and smile. Put your hand out, say hello, I don't know your name, and say good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm good, how are you? Because she answered me, she's letting me into her world. I'm close enough, not really, but for her to be able to see me. A lot of times I like to be on the same level as people because I don't like to tower over people and not to stand in front of them to make it a block. You kind of stand a little bit to the side and give them an out if they don't want to have anything to do with me. So you want to always say hello, call them by name if you can, and wait for them to respond back. Sometimes that takes a little while for some people. You know, it might take a whole minute. But if you call them by name, it might, you know, they might realize that they're talking to you. So you want to maintain eye contact. You don't want to be confrontational. And ask them something that they can answer. So, you also want to, you know, look for their body language. See if they're accepting to what you're talking about. And don't be intimidating. If you're asking a question that they don't know the answer to, that is a constant reminder that they are forgetting things. It causes anxiety. Oh my goodness, I don't know what they're, you know, like what did you have for lunch? How many people here always remember what they had for their last meal or their lunch last week? I think all of us forget that every once in a while. So families always do that. They come and say, so what did you have for lunch? You know, and then people can't, I don't know. I don't remember, which is so common. So a better question might be, did you like the chicken that they had today? You know, so just give them some clues. Sometimes it's a little bit easier because not all of us remember what we did or a little bit while ago. But most of the time we're able to recall that in our memory. People with memory loss, because it's short-term memory, might not be able to do that. There's another thing, too. If you want to kind of go where they are, if they're looking for their mother, you don't want to tell them your mother died 20 years ago, because that might be the first time that they remember hearing that information. And they'll grieve all over again. So what do? We say, tell me about your mother. Was she a good cook? What was her favorite meal that she used to cook for you? And that will totally change the subject and get them talking about their mother, and then they forgot what they were looking for her. Because it's a constant reminder. You don't want to remind them over and over again that they have died, because they'll grieve all over again just like they heard it for the first time. So when you're offering choices like getting dressed, do you want to wear green pants or blue pants? You don't want them to look at the whole closet, because it's way too overwhelming. You want to narrow the choices down. We like to do 2. You know, some people can handle more than that. You know, if they're looking for something, are you thirsty? Are you hungry? If you narrow it down to I'm thirsty, do you want something cold? Do you want something hot? If they say they want something hot, do you want coffee? Do you want tea? Because they might not always be able to come up with the answer, but if you offer it to them, they'll be able to choose. And they'll feel much more in control. When sitting and chatting, it's easier for them to automatically respond or comment on something in the environment than to try to initiate a conversation. So utilize the environment. If you're sitting at a park, there's children playing, they're going to comment on that. If you're outside, they're going to hear the birds, they're going to see the leaves, they're going to look at the flowers. Excuse me. So utilize that. If there's other things going on in the environment, utilize that, because they'll be able to call, oh, I like that piece of art. Oh, well, look at those beautiful flowers. And that will get a whole conversation going. When you're going for a walk, just make sure that it's not too stimulating, though, that the radio isn't on and the TV isn't on. It's hard to, focus. Everybody has a hard time focusing when there's a lot going on in the environment. If there's road work being done outside. And also tap into those long-term memories and talking about an event that's connected with an emotion. Like, wasn't that great, wedding, or didn't we have a good time at the dance, or, something that's familiar that they can bring back. The environment should be structured with cues and reminders, supportive, engaging with a purpose, and most importantly, be failure-free and successful. Idle time is deadly for people with memory loss. They're worried about, what am I forgetting? Where am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to be doing? Because they can't organize that. They also want to do things right. They don't want to be embarrassed, or they don't want to be found out. They want to save face. To get things done, offer choices and selections to help them make the right choice. If they don't want to take a shower today, well, we're going to have company. What do you want to wear today? Have you thought about that? They're still, in their mind, they're still capable. Some of the residents I have think they're still working. They work for me, actually. They think they do. Nothing has changed for them. They think they are who they have always been. They need to be in control. A lot of people that have been control and big people in their jobs think they're still working and in charge. So the first thing they lose is time orientation and the ability to organize tasks. So keep instructions really simple. You can't say to someone, go down there, go down to your apartment, hang up your coat, go to the bathroom and come back. You got to keep things really simple. Let's go down to your apartment. And then, I'm going that way, can I walk with you? It's just so much easier. Don't argue, try not to correct them, and you don't always have to be right. And if things aren't going well, change the subject. Anger is usually due to fear. Accept the blame. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm so sorry. And then change the subject and move on. Because the more that you can contradict what they're saying, the more they're going to dig in their heels and the more they want to be right. Even if you offer them something, $1 million, they're not going to take it. So you just walk away, come back. I had a lady that every once in a while she'd get really, really angry, and she never knew why. But she'd sit there and argue with you. Her daughter came in, and would sit there and try to get her in a better mood. 45 minutes later, the lady was still angry and stayed angry for the rest of the day. So I said to the daughter, just try this. Say, I have a phone call, I have to leave. She went back 5 minutes later. Hey, Ma, how are you? I'm so glad to see you. She didn't remember she was there, and she was sitting there mad. She said, I don't know why I'm mad, but let's go for a walk. So the more emotion and the more emotionally charged confrontations get, the longer they stay. And they'll come back and haunt you later. They'll be angry later and you don't know why. So you want to review things with them, remind them, and remember things. Evoke emotions whenever you're talking. I like to do something that when families come to visit and they have a great visit, I'll remind the person the next day, oh, it was so nice to see you talking with Joe. Looked like you were having a good time. I really love that story about such and such and such and such. And they'll remember that, and the emotion will come back, and they relive that experience over and over again. We try to use more senses, just more than one sense. Seeing, hearing, touching. And going to revisit the past and simplify your expectations. And celebrate special moments. Challenge your brain and stay physically healthy and cognitively healthy. Engage in what is left. Although that can change from moment to moment, hour to hour, and day to day. So if it worked yesterday, doesn't mean it's going to work today. Sometimes you need to provide props for memories, photographs, certain stories that evoke a lot of conversation, and subjects to talk about that you know are successful. We call it setting the stage. And when the stage is set right, the person comes alive, and you see who they are, and that personality, and they have fun again. Rhythm and emotion is the last to go, so music is so important. So when you go visit a friend, you may need to bring another person with you to spur some of the conversation. So what can you do? Visit and maintain connections with old friends. It's good for the caregiver, but it's also good for the friend with memory loss. It takes a village. Sometimes it's easier if you think in advance some of the things you want to talk about. I have a resident, and her name is Candy. She has 4 friends from grammar school that come and visit every month. They sit there for an hour or so, they laugh, they talk about stories, and they have a grand old time. Sometimes they talk about the same thing every time she comes, but they have a great time. So then we had a new resident that moved in, and it turned out that that woman was the Girl Scout leader of all of those people. So then when they got to know her, they brought her into the stories, and they would share the afternoon with her and tell her how wonderful it was when she was their Girl Scout leader. So one day when the ladies were visiting, the Girl Scout leader passed away, and her daughter came to clean out the apartment. So I brought her over to the friends that she knew growing up, and they sat there for an hour or two and talked about how wonderful her mother was and all the memories they had. What a tribute to her mother. It was terrific. They laughed, they had a good time, and it wasn't so devastating for the daughter. So I will close with this thought from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. People will never forget how you made them feel. Thank you.